Turn around. Put your hands on the roof. Now!
Fellas, let's just stop this. My name's David Harper. As of Monday, I'm the new Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs, so I think I'm going to be your new boss.
The city baked under the relentless glare of a Tuesday morning sun. Inside the air-conditioned cocoon of Unit 714, the world outside was a silent, shimmering film of heat haze and exhaust fumes. Officer Kyler Vance, all of 28 years old, tapped a restless rhythm on the steering wheel of the patrol cruiser. His jaw was set in a permanent clench, a physical manifestation of a worldview that saw the urban landscape not as a community of citizens, but as a grid of potential threats and simmering disorder. He was a man who believed in clean lines, clear rules, and the righteous application of force to maintain them. Ambiguity to Kyler was a synonym for weakness. His partner, Mark O'Malley, was 15 years his senior and 100 pounds heavier in both body and spirit. Mark watched the city drift by with the weary resignation of a man who had long ago traded ideals for pragmatism. He'd seen rookies like Kyler before, burning hot, convinced of their own clarity, seeing every interaction as a test of will. He'd learned that the most important part of his job wasn't always enforcing the law, but often managing the coiled spring energy of the young man sitting next to him. "You see that guy back there?" Kyler muttered, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, tracking a man who had jaywalked a block behind them. "The way he looked at the car, like he was daring us. That's how it starts. Little bit of disrespect, then it's breaking a window, then it's something worse. You give them an inch." Mark sighed, a slow release of air. "Or maybe his feet hurt and he was just trying to get across the street, Kai. Not everything's a prelude to a felony." "It's about standards, Mark. Order," Kyler retorted, his voice tight. "The second you let the small stuff slide, you lose the whole neighborhood. It's a message." Before Mark could formulate a placating response, the radio crackled, slicing through the tension. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, professional, a familiar current in their daily river of routine and chaos. "All units in Sector 3 be advised. Report of a 211 in progress. Westgate Lofts, 1400 Elysian Drive. Repeat, auto theft in progress. Suspect is described as a male, black, 40s, wearing a polo shirt and slacks. Attempting to gain entry to a late-model black Lincoln Navigator. No weapons seen. Unit 714, what's your 20? Kyler was already reaching for the microphone, the earlier conversation forgotten, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated purpose. "Unit 714, show us responding," he said, his voice a different instrument now, sharp, clear, authoritative. "We're 5 minutes out." He flicked on the sirens. The sudden, piercing wail seemed to tear a hole in the morning's oppressive heat. The cruiser leaped forward, Kyler's hands firm and steady on the wheel as he expertly navigated through the midday traffic. Mark O'Malley grabbed the console to steady himself, a familiar knot tightening in his gut. It was always like this with Kyler. A switch was flipped. The philosopher of broken windows became the instrument of swift action. Westgate Lofts. Mark knew the place. It was one of those new, aggressively modern complexes that had sprung up in the gentrified part of downtown, all glass and steel, with valet parking and a concierge. A black Lincoln Navigator in that parking garage was probably worth more than Mark's first house. It was a high-stakes call in a high-income area, the kind of situation that could get messy if not handled with precision and a cool head. Kyler was a model of precision. The cool head was another matter. "Right in the resident garage, dispatch says," Kyler narrated, his eyes scanning the road, his mind clearly already at the scene, running through tactical scenarios. "Polo shirt and slacks. Sounds like he's trying to blend in. Smart, but not smart enough." Mark stayed quiet, his own mind running through a different set of checklists. He cataloged the details. Male, black, 40s, expensive car, luxury apartment building. The combination of those elements was a volatile mix in the city's simmering pot of social and racial tensions. It was a call that required nuance, a delicate touch. And a delicate touch was not in Kyler Vance's toolkit. He owned a hammer, and to him, Every problem looked increasingly like a nail. As they screeched to a halt at the entrance to the gleaming subterranean parking garage, the sirens died abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. The air was thick with the smell of hot concrete and wealth. Kyler killed the lights, plunging them into a momentary darkness before his eyes adjusted. "There," he breathed, his voice low. 50 yards away, bathed in the cool, sterile light of the overhead fluorescent lamps, was a black Lincoln Navigator, parked neatly in a reserved spot. And beside it stood a man, perfectly matching the dispatcher's description. He was tall, with a calm, composed posture. His back was to them, and he was focused intently on the driver's side door, a long, thin piece of metal in his hand, working it skillfully into the seam of the window. The scene was exactly as described, a textbook auto theft. For Officer Kyler Vance, the world had suddenly snapped into perfect, simple focus. He unholstered his Glock, the click of the retention strap unnervingly loud in the quiet garage. "Show me your hands," he rehearsed under his breath, his knuckles white on the grip of his firearm. Mark O'Malley watched his partner, and the knot in his stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. Something about the man's posture, his unhurried confidence, felt wrong. He didn't look like a car thief. He looked like he was trying to solve a frustrating puzzle. But Mark knew that in Kyler's black and white world, there was no room for such distinctions. They were here to stop a crime, and Kyler Vance was ready to do exactly that. The air in the underground garage was still and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat they had just left. The only sounds were the low hum of the ventilation system and the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal on glass. Kyler Vance moved like a predator, his steps light and purposeful, weapon held in a low-ready position. Mark O'Malley followed a few paces behind, his hand resting on his own holstered sidearm, his eyes scanning the periphery for unseen threats, a habit born of 2 decades on the force. His focus, however, was split, half on the potential suspect, half on the coiled aggression of his partner. "Police! Let me see your hands! Do it now!" Kyler's voice boomed, shattering the quiet. It was his command voice, practiced and absolute, designed to seize control and brook no argument. The man at the Lincoln Navigator didn't startle. He didn't bolt. His movements were fluid and deliberate. He carefully withdrew the slim metal tool from the car door, placed it gently on the roof of the vehicle, and then turned around slowly, raising his hands to shoulder height, palms open. He was in his early 40s, with intelligent, assessing eyes and a face that was calm to the point of being serene. He was dressed in a well-fitting navy blue polo shirt and gray slacks. A tasteful, leather-banded watch adorned his wrist. He looked less like a car thief and more like a university professor or a tech executive who had been interrupted during a moment of inconvenient personal logistics. His gaze flickered from Kyler's drawn weapon to Mark's more cautious posture. "Easy there, officers," the man said, his voice even and untroubled. It carried a natural authority that seemed to clash with the situation. "No need for all this excitement." "Face the vehicle! Put your hands on the roof!" Kyler barked, ignoring the man's calm demeanor. He saw defiance where there was none, a trick of the mind fueled by adrenaline and preconception. The man complied, placing his palms flat on the tinted glass of the SUV's roof. He let out a sigh, not of fear, but of what sounded like weary exasperation. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice slightly muffled as he faced the car. "This is my vehicle." Kyler let out a short, derisive laugh. "That's what they all say. Heard that one before? You have the keys to your vehicle?" "That's the problem," the man said, a hint of wry humor in his tone. "If I had the keys, I wouldn't be standing here giving your morning a jolt of drama. I left them on my kitchen counter, locked myself out. The building concierge called a locksmith, but it was a 2-hour wait. I figured I could get it done faster myself. I've done it before." Mark O'Malley felt a prickle of doubt. The story was plausible. The man's calm confidence was unnerving. Thieves were usually jumpy, their stories a jumble of panicked lies. This man was talking to them as if they were providing an inconvenient interruption to his day. "He's got a point, Kai," Mark said quietly, moving up beside his partner. "Let's just ask for his ID. We can run the plates." Kyler shot him a venomous look. "You want to run the plates? We caught him red-handed, Mark. He's got a Slim Jim in his hand." He gestured with his chin towards the tool on the roof. "That's possession of burglary tools right there." He advanced on the man, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "What's your name?" The man remained still, his hands flat on the roof. "My name is David Harper." "All right, David Harper," Kyler said, infusing the name with sarcastic disbelief. "You got some identification on you that says you own this brand new Lincoln Navigator?" "I do," David replied. "It's in my wallet, which is in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance card are in the glove compartment, which, as you can see, is currently inaccessible." Kyler holstered his weapon, but his posture remained aggressive. "All right, I'm going to get your wallet. You move a muscle and this is going to go very differently for you. You understand me?" "I understand you perfectly, officer," David said, his voice still unnervingly level. As Kyler reached forward to retrieve the wallet, Mark spoke up again, an urgent edge to his voice. "Kyler, hold up. Let's just run the plates first. It takes 30 seconds. He was trying to give his partner an out, a chance to de-escalate, to let procedure override pride. Kyler ignored him. He deftly pulled the wallet from David's pocket and stepped back, flipping it open. He pulled out the driver's license. The name matched. David Harper. The address listed was for this very building, the Westgate Lofts. Mark felt a wave of relief. "See? He lives here. It's his car, Kai. Let's just apologize for the misunderstanding and get back on the road." But Kyler wasn't looking at the address. His eyes were narrowed, his mind working, trying to reconcile the facts with his gut instinct. He believed he had caught a criminal, and he was unwilling to let go of that belief. The calm, the expensive clothes, the confident speech, in Kyler's mind, it was all part of a sophisticated act. David Harper seemed to sense the internal struggle playing out behind the officer's stony facade. He decided to end the charade. He let his hands drop from the roof and turned around slowly, a wry, tired smile on his face. The smile didn't reach his eyes, which were now sharp and analytical, as if he were the one assessing them and not the other way around. "All right, fellas, look," he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I can see this is getting complicated. Let's just stop this before it goes any further. My name is David Harper, and as of this coming Monday, I'll be the new Deputy Chief of the Internal Affairs Division for the city's police department." He paused, letting the words sink into the cool, still air of the garage. "So," he finished, his smile becoming a little more genuine, "I think I'm going to be your new boss." An electric silence descended. Mark O'Malley's jaw went slack. He stared at David, then at Kyler, his mind struggling to process the sheer, catastrophic absurdity of the statement. Kyler Vance simply stood there, his face a mask of disbelief. The wallet in his hand suddenly felt like it was burning. For a long, priceless moment, the only sound in the garage was the low hum of the ventilation system, an indifferent witness to what was either the most audacious lie a car thief had ever told, or the single most career-ending mistake an officer could possibly make. The silence in the parking garage was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Mark O'Malley felt like he was underwater, the world moving in slow, distorted motion. He looked at David Harper's face, calm, confident, and now carrying the unmistakable weight of a truth so inconvenient it sounded like a fantasy. Then he looked at Kyler. He saw the initial shock on his partner's face quickly curdle into something else. Indignation. It was the anger of a man who felt he was being mocked, his intelligence insulted. Kyler let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement, but of pure contempt. "Deputy Chief? Of IA?" He shook his head, a smirk twisting his lips. "That's a good one. A real good one. You almost had me." "It's not a joke, officer," David said, his tone shifting. The wry humor was gone, replaced by a quiet, firm seriousness. My appointment was approved by the City Council last Thursday. The internal memo is scheduled to go out tomorrow morning. You can call the chief's office right now if you'd like. I'm sure his assistant Mary would be happy to verify it for you. The level of detail was staggering. The specific day, the internal memo, the assistant's name. For Mark, these were the data points of truth, puzzle pieces snapping into a horrifyingly clear picture. He took a hesitant step forward. Kai, maybe we should make that call, just to be sure. But Kyler wasn't listening. He was trapped in a feedback loop of his own conviction. A black man in a polo shirt trying to break into an SUV was a car thief. That was the established reality. This new information, this impossible, absurd claim, was a lie designed to subvert that reality. To accept it would mean his instincts, the very foundation of his policing philosophy, were wrong. And Kyler Vance was never wrong. You think I'm an idiot? Kyler snapped, taking a menacing step toward David. You think you can just throw out some big title and we'll what? Apologize and let you go on your merry way? You're a car thief who got caught, and now you're trying to talk your way out of it with the most ridiculous story I've ever heard. David's gaze hardened. He was no longer looking at Kyler as a police officer, but as a problem to be managed, a dangerous variable that was escalating beyond reason. Officer, he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word a carefully placed stone. I am giving you a chance to de-escalate this situation. I am telling you who I am. The evidence, my driver's license, the address, the details I've just provided, all supports what I'm saying. Your professional skepticism is one thing. This is becoming something else. Something else? Kyler shot back, his face flushing with anger. Yeah, it's becoming an arrest for auto theft, possession of burglary tools, and now lying to a police officer. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. Now. This was it. The precipice. Mark saw it coming. Kyler, no! He said, his voice sharp with urgency. For God's sake, just wait! Let me call the sergeant. Let me run the plates. Don't do this! He was pleading not just for David Harper, but for his partner. He could see the career suicide happening in real time, a slow-motion train wreck of ego and pride. Kyler turned his head slightly, his eyes cold slits. Stay out of this, Mark. I've got this under control. He turned back to David, who hadn't moved. David stood his ground, not out of defiance, but with the posture of a man making a final, silent appeal to reason. His eyes were locked on Kyler's, and in them was a profound, almost sorrowful disappointment. It was the look of a man who had dedicated his life to a system, only to be confronted by its most glaring failure. He wasn't just a victim of a bad cop. He was a doctor watching a disease he was hired to cure consume a patient right in front of him. Officer Vance, David said, reading the name tag on Kyler's uniform for the first time, his voice now devoid of any warmth. This is your last opportunity to stop. If you proceed, I assure you the consequences will be severe, and they will be permanent. The use of his name, the quiet, chilling finality of the warning, it was the wrong thing to say to Kyler Vance. It wasn't a warning to him, it was a threat. It was the final confirmation in his mind that this was a power play, a challenge he had to meet with overwhelming force. You're threatening me now? Kyler spat, his hand reaching for his handcuffs. You have no idea who you're messing with. On the contrary, David said softly, a deep sadness in his voice. I know exactly who you are, Officer Vance, and the real tragedy is, you have no idea who I am. The chasm between the two men was now absolute. On one side stood a man armed with the truth, a man whose entire career was built on understanding the nuances of policing, procedure, and the law. On the other stood a man armed with a badge and a story he had told himself, a story in which he was the hero, and any contradiction was the work of a villain. Mark O'Malley watched, helpless, as his partner took the final, irrevocable step over the edge. The quiet hum of the garage felt like a roar in his ears. The moment felt both infinitely long and terrifyingly fast. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they were no longer just responding to a call. They were creating an incident, one that would be studied, dissected, and remembered in the department for years to come. A textbook example of how a routine stop could become a career-ending catastrophe. The moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken warnings and fatal pride. David Harper stood his ground, his posture a silent testament to a principle. He had offered the truth. He had offered a path to de-escalation. He had offered Officer Vance a way back from the precipice. All of his offers had been refused. Kyler Vance saw only one thing: defiance. In his world, a lawful order was absolute, and the refusal to comply was the ultimate sin. David Harper's stillness was, to him, a physical manifestation of resistance. He closed the remaining distance between them in 2 quick steps. "I said turn around and put your hands behind your back!" Kyler yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. His hands shot out, grabbing David's left arm. The contact was a shock to the system. It was the point where the theoretical became brutally physical. David didn't flinch or resist, but his body tensed at the violation. The touch was not that of an officer securing a suspect. It was the grip of a man exerting dominance, a point being made through force. "Do not put your hands on me, officer," David said, his voice dangerously quiet, a low rumble of controlled fury. Mark O'Malley, who had been frozen in a state of horrified indecision, was finally jolted into action. "Kyler, damn it, stop!" he shouted, moving forward, his hand out as if to physically separate them. "This is a mistake!" Kyler shoved him back with his free hand. "I gave him a lawful order, Mark! He's resisting!" He spun David around with surprising force, wrenching his arms behind his back. The move was clumsy, unnecessarily violent, fueled by a rage that had been building since the moment David had dared to challenge his authority. David, caught off balance, stumbled forward, his shoulder bumping hard against the side of the Navigator. The Slim Jim he had placed on the roof clattered to the ground, a small metallic sound that was almost lost in the sudden chaos. He didn't fight back. He knew that any physical resistance, no matter how justified, would be twisted and used against him. It would validate Vance's narrative. His only weapon now was a disciplined, profound stillness. He would be the calm center of the storm his accuser had created. The cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs closed around his wrists. The sharp click, click, click as the ratchet tightened was the loudest sound David had ever heard. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a professional boundary shattered. It was the sound of a system turning on itself. In that moment, David Harper was no longer the incoming Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs. He was just another black man in handcuffs, his rights and his identity erased by the narrative of a single angry police officer. The bite of the metal into his skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal insanity. "You are under arrest," Kyler panted, his voice ringing with a strange mix of triumph and adrenaline, "for attempted grand theft auto, possession of burglary tools, and resisting a law enforcement officer." He yanked David upright, his grip tight on his bicep. Mark O'Malley stared, his face a canvas of disbelief and shame. He looked at David Harper's calm, resolute face, then at his partner's flushed, victorious one. He had failed. His job was to back up his partner, but it was also to stop him from making a catastrophic error. He had tried, but his words had been useless against the brick wall of Kyler's ego. He saw the future spooling out in front of them, the reports, the hearings, the inevitable lawsuit. It was a disaster of their own making. A car pulled into the garage, its headlights washing over the scene for a brief moment. A woman in a business suit at the wheel slowed down, her eyes widening as she took in the tableau. 2 police officers, one with his hand on a handcuffed black man standing next to a luxury SUV. She quickly looked away and sped up, eager to get away from a scene that confirmed a story she already knew. David looked over his shoulder at Kyler, his eyes holding no fear, only a piercing, analytical clarity. "Officer Vance," he said, his voice completely steady, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You have just arrested a superior officer. You have done so without proper cause and with excessive force. I am invoking my right to remain silent. and I am requesting that my attorney be present for any questioning." He then turned his gaze to Mark. "And you, Officer O'Malley, I want you to document everything you have just witnessed. Every word, every action. Your report will be very important." It was not a plea, it was a directive. In the most powerless position of his life, bound in handcuffs, David Harper was still in command. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead, laying the groundwork for the battle to come. Kyler just sneered, pulling David toward the patrol car. "You can call your attorney from the station, Chief." As Kyler pushed him toward the cruiser, David saw the Slim Jim lying on the clean concrete floor of the garage. It looked small and insignificant, a simple tool. But in that moment, it was the fulcrum on which his life, Kyler Vance's career, and a part of the city's future had just pivoted. The click of those handcuffs had not been an end. It was the beginning. It was the sound of a war being declared. The back of the patrol car was a cage of hard plastic and stale air. It smelled of sweat, cheap disinfectant, and the faint, lingering scent of fear from 100 prior occupants. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, David watched the pristine parking garage of his own apartment building recede as Kyler pulled away, tires squealing slightly in a juvenile display of aggression. He sat in silence, the handcuffs digging into his wrists with every bump and turn. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that threatened to suffocate him. He was a professional, a man who had spent 2 decades upholding the very laws he was now accused of breaking, and he was being treated like a common street criminal by a young, arrogant officer who was a walking embodiment of the problems he'd been hired to fix. His training kicked in, a lifetime of discipline overriding the raw emotion. He began to compartmentalize, to observe. He noted the time on the cruiser's clock. He mentally replayed the entire encounter, cataloging Kyler's words, his actions, Mark O'Malley's hesitant protests. He was no longer just the victim. He was the primary investigator in the case against his own arresting officer. The drive to the downtown precinct was short. As Kyler led him through the sally port, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind them, the sound echoed the finality of his situation. He was inside the machine now. Officers at their desks looked up as he was led through the bullpen, their conversations faltering. They saw the uniform of the arresting officer, then the expensive clothes and the composed demeanor of the man in cuffs. It was an unusual sight, and it drew a ripple of confused, curious stares. Kyler pushed him toward the booking desk with a sense of performative ownership. The desk was presided over by Sergeant Eva Rostova, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense air that had been hardened by 30 years on the job. Her nameplate sat on the high counter, a small monument to her longevity and authority. "Got one for booking, Sarge," Kyler announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. He dropped David's wallet and the Slim Jim, now in an evidence bag, onto the counter. "Attempted GTA, possession of Berg tools, and resisting." Sergeant Rostova looked from Kyler's smug face to David's impassive one. She picked up the evidence bag, looking at the Slim Jim, then at the high-end leather wallet. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. Her gaze lingered on David's clothes, his watch, his calm posture. She'd booked thousands of people in her career. She could smell the difference between a real criminal and a situation that was profoundly wrong. This one reeked. "Resisting?" she asked, her voice dry. She looked back at David. "He doesn't look like much of a resistor to me. What's the story, Vance?" "Caught him breaking into a navigator over at the Westgate Lofts," Kyler said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Gave me a whole song and dance about it being his car. Then he claimed he was the new deputy chief." A few officers within earshot chuckled. Sergeant Rostova did not. Her eyes narrowed. She picked up the wallet and opened it, pulling out the driver's license. "David Harper," she read aloud. She typed the name into her computer terminal. Then she looked at the address on the license. "Address is 1400 Elysian Drive. Isn't that the Westgate Lofts?" "It's part of his cover, Sarge," Kyler insisted, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face for the first time. The story sounded thinner under the flat, fluorescent lights of the precinct and the piercing gaze of a veteran sergeant. His cover? Rostova repeated, her tone sharp with sarcasm. So his cover involves getting a legitimate driver's license with the address of the place he plans to rob. That's a new one. She turned her attention back to her computer screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was no longer just running a standard background check, she was digging. Clean record, not so much as a parking ticket. Decorated detective from the Chicago PD for 15 years. Resigned 2 months ago to accept a new position. She stopped typing and looked up, her eyes locking onto Kyler's. Her face was grim. You pulled this man away from his own vehicle, in his own parking garage, and arrested him, she asked, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. He was using a Slim Jim. He refused to comply, Kyler blustered, his confidence rapidly eroding under her scrutiny. He told you who he was, didn't he? Rostova pressed. He told me a lie to get out of an arrest. Sergeant Rostova just shook her head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on her face. She had seen this movie before. A young cop, high on authority, who couldn't tell the difference between a real threat and a bruised ego. She turned to the booking officer beside her. Process him, and be quick about it. Then she shot a final, withering glare at Kyler. Vance, my office, now! The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. David's fingerprints were taken, the ink smearing on his skin. A mugshot was taken, the flash of the camera capturing his exhausted but defiant expression. He was instructed to remove his belt and shoelaces. Each item was placed in a plastic bag and catalogued with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identity Kyler Vance had refused to believe was now being meticulously documented as part of his supposed crime. The young officer handling the booking was nervous, his hands trembling slightly. He avoided making eye contact with David. The entire station was buzzing now. Whispers were spreading. The name David Harper was being spoken in hushed, anxious tones. The story of Kyler Vance arresting the man rumored to be the new IA chief was starting to sound less like a joke and more like a ticking time bomb. Through the frosted glass of Sergeant Rostova's office, David could see two silhouettes. He could hear the muffled but heated sound of her voice, rising and falling in a controlled fury. Kyler Vance wasn't being praised for his decisive action, he was being dismantled. The walls of his righteous certainty were beginning to crumble. After the indignity of the booking process, David was led to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan and slammed shut with a deafening clang. The lock engaged, and he was alone. The cell was a small, cold box of concrete and steel, furnished with nothing more than a bench and a toilet. It smelled of bleach and despair. He sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his slacks, and for the first time since the encounter began, he allowed himself a moment, not of fear or anger, but of a profound, bone-deep sorrow. He had seen the ugly side of policing, the corruption, the brutality, the incompetence. He had dedicated his life to fighting it from within, and now he was sitting in one of its cages. He knew he was entitled to a phone call. The young, nervous booking officer had mumbled it during the processing. It was a right, but it was also a strategic weapon. Who he called and what he said would determine the trajectory of the next few hours. He could call his wife, but that would only cause her immense worry. He could call a lawyer, and he would, eventually. But first, he needed to make a different kind of call. He needed to activate the system, to send a shockwave up the chain of command from the very bottom. He rattled the bars of his cell. "Officer!" he called out, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to make my phone call now." The nervous booking officer, Patterson, appeared a moment later. "Yes, sir. Who are you calling?" The "sir" was new. Word was clearly spreading. "I need a number for the office of City Manager Reynolds," David said. Patterson's eyes widened. This was not the standard call to a bail bondsman or a worried spouse. "The city manager, sir?" "That's correct," David said. "And if you can't get through to him directly, I'll take the private line for Police Chief Michael Donovan." Patterson practically stumbled over himself in his haste to comply. He led David to a small, grimy alcove with a phone bolted to the wall. He handed David the receiver as if it were a live grenade. David dialed the number for the city manager's office from memory. It went to voicemail, as expected after business hours. He hung up and dialed the next number, the one he knew would be answered. 2 rings and then a crisp, professional voice. "Chief Donovan." "Chief, this is David Harper." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "David, where are you? I was expecting to hear from you tomorrow to finalize your start." "Well, I decided to get a bit of a head start on familiarizing myself with the department's operations," David said, a hint of ice in his voice. "Specifically, your booking procedures at the downtown precinct. I'm calling you from a holding cell." The silence that followed was heavier this time. David could almost hear the gears turning in the chief's head, the frantic calculation of what he was being told. "You're where?" Donovan finally stammered. "I was arrested about an hour ago, Chief, in my own parking garage, for attempting to steal my own vehicle. The arresting officer is a Kyler Vance. He was not receptive to my explanation of the situation." "My God," Donovan breathed. David heard a frantic shuffling of papers in the background, then the sound of another door opening. Donovan was moving, his voice now tight with controlled panic. "David, stay right where you are. Don't say another word to anyone. I'm on my way. I'm 10 minutes out. Who's the shift commander?" "A Sergeant Eva Rostova," David replied. "And I have to say, Chief, she seems to be the only person here who understands the gravity of the situation your officer has created." "I'll handle it," Donovan said, his voice a strained whisper. "We're going to fix this." He hung up. The effect of that phone call was almost instantaneous. The low-level hum of the precinct transformed. A palpable current of panic began to flow through the station. Sergeant Rostova, who had been methodically tearing apart Kyler Vance's report in her office, suddenly emerged, her face grim. She barked an order at Patterson, who immediately unlocked David's cell. "Mr. Harper, my profound apologies," Rostova said, her voice stiff with a mixture of professional courtesy and fury at her own officer. "Chief Donovan is on his way. Please, come with me. We'll get you to a more comfortable waiting area." She led him not to a grimy interview room, but to her own office. She offered him a bottle of water. Kyler Vance was nowhere to be seen. He had likely been sequestered in another room, the source of the contagion now in quarantine. Mark O'Malley stood by the booking desk, his face pale and haggard. He looked at David with an expression of profound apology and shame, but said nothing. Less than 10 minutes later, Police Chief Michael Donovan burst through the doors of the precinct. He was a tall, imposing man in a sharply tailored suit, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He strode through the bullpen, ignoring the salutes of his officers, his eyes fixed on Sergeant Rostova's office. He walked in without knocking. "David," he said, his voice strained. He extended a hand. "I cannot begin to tell you how sorry I am." David did not take his hand. He remained seated, his gaze level and cold. "Sorry isn't going to be enough, Michael," he said softly. "This wasn't a simple mistake. This was a systemic failure with a badge and a gun." The chief's face fell. He knew in that moment that this wasn't a problem he could fix with an apology and a handshake. The arrest of David Harper was not the end of a bad traffic stop. It was the opening salvo of a war that was about to consume his department. The phone call had put out the immediate fire, but the entire forest was about to burn. David Harper walked out of the downtown precinct under the cloak of a pre-dawn sky. The formal apology from Chief Donovan had been delivered with a palpable mix of desperation and fear. His personal effects had been returned with an almost comical reverence. The charges had not just been dropped, they had been expunged with a speed that suggested they never existed, a frantic attempt to rewrite history. Officer Kyler Vance had been placed on administrative leave, a ghost removed from the scene of the crime. But David knew it was all cosmetic. An institutional wound had been opened, and it could not be closed with bureaucratic bandages. He wasn't driven home in a patrol car. A black, unmarked sedan, personally driven by a deputy chief, was waiting for him. The silence during the ride was heavy with unspoken things. David knew the department's leadership was hoping this gesture, this high-level taxi service, would be enough. They were hoping he would see the incident as an aberration, an unfortunate hazing ritual on his first day, and that he would quietly assume his new role and let the matter die. They had profoundly misjudged their man. The next morning, David did not report to the chief's office to begin his new job. Instead, he walked into the sun-drenched, minimalist office of Evelyn Reed. Reed was a legend in legal circles, a civil rights attorney with a reputation for being as brilliant as she was relentless. She had spent 30 years taking on police departments, city governments, and federal agencies, and she had a trophy room of multi-million-dollar verdicts and landmark legal precedents to show for it. She was in her early 60s, with a sharp, angular face, piercing blue eyes, and a mane of silver hair tied back in a severe bun. She listened to David's story without interruption, her expression unreadable, her fingers steepled under her chin. David recounted the entire event with the dispassionate precision of an investigator delivering a report. He detailed the initial contact, Vance's immediate aggression, his own attempts to de-escalate, O'Malley's ignored warnings, the physical assault of the arrest, and the systematic humiliation of the booking process. He left nothing out. When he finished, Evelyn Reed was silent for a long moment. She rose from her chair and walked to the large window overlooking the city skyline. The police headquarters was visible in the distance, a concrete monolith against the morning sky. "What they did to you, David, was not a mistake," she said, her back still to him. "A mistake is a typo in a report. A mistake is taking a wrong turn on the way to a call. What Officer Vance did was a choice. It was a series of choices, each one fueled by a toxic combination of ego, insecurity, and a deeply ingrained prejudice that he likely isn't even aware he has." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. He didn't see a citizen in need of help. He didn't even see a potential suspect to be investigated. He saw a black man who didn't fit his narrow, preconceived notion of who should be driving a Lincoln Navigator in that neighborhood. And when you challenged that notion, not with aggression, but with a calm authority he couldn't comprehend, his entire worldview short-circuited. He had to put you in a box he understood, so he put you in handcuffs. "I know," David said quietly. "I've seen officers like him my entire career. I was hired to root them out." "And on your first day, you became their target," Evelyn finished. "The irony is poetic. It's also legally actionable on a massive scale." She walked back to her desk and sat down, all business now. "The chief will want this to go away. He'll offer you a quiet settlement, a promotion, maybe even Vance's head on a platter. He'll promise sweeping reforms that you and I both know are just words on paper. It's the standard playbook. Do not take it." "I have no intention of taking it," David said, his voice firm. "Good," Evelyn nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. "Because this isn't about your job, David. This is about your rights. We are not going to file a simple complaint with the department. We are going to file a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. We will argue that Officer Vance, acting under the color of law, deprived you of your Fourth Amendment right against unlawful seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. We will add state-level claims for false arrest, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." She leaned forward, her voice dropping, each word precise and weighted. "We will sue Officer Vance individually to hold him personally accountable. And we will sue the city for its failure to properly train, supervise, and discipline its officers. Vance is not a random bad apple. He's the poison fruit of a rotten tree. We're not just going after the soldier, we're going after the army that sent him into battle unprepared and filled his head with the wrong ideology." The lawsuit was no longer a vague possibility. It was a weapon being forged right in front of him. It was a declaration that this would not be handled behind closed doors. It would be fought in the open, in a federal courtroom, where the actions of Officer Vance and the department that created him would be exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The battle lines had been drawn. In the modern age, justice is often a race between the slow, methodical grinding of the legal system and the instantaneous, explosive judgment of the court of public opinion. David Harper's case was about to become a textbook example. As Evelyn Reed and her team were meticulously drafting the federal complaint, a new piece of evidence emerged from the digital ether, an element none of them had anticipated. It came from the woman in the business suit, the one who had driven through the parking garage in the middle of the arrest. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a mid-level marketing executive who happened to be leaving for an early meeting. The sight of the confrontation had unsettled her, and a primal civic instinct had compelled her to lift her phone and record. Her hands were shaking, and the video was shot through her driver's side window, partially obscured by the concrete pillars of the garage. But it captured the most critical 60 seconds of the encounter. The video, grainy and unsteady, showed Kyler Vance spinning a calm, unresisting David Harper around. It clearly captured Vance's unnecessary force and David's stumble against the SUV. The audio was muffled, but the sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs being ratcheted tight were perfectly, chillingly clear. And it captured Mark O'Malley standing a few feet away, his hands raised in a helpless, pleading gesture, his face a mask of anguish. It was a 60-second silent movie of a gross injustice. Sarah Jenkins went home that night, troubled by what she'd seen. She read the local news online, searching for any mention of the arrest. Nothing. The next day, she saw a headline: "Local PD taps Chicago veteran as new IA deputy chief." The article featured a picture. It was the man from the garage. Horrified, she realized the significance of what she had filmed. She sent the video to a reporter at a local investigative news station. Within an hour, the story exploded. The video, stripped of context but potent in its raw imagery, was a digital wildfire. The news station ran it on a loop, juxtaposed with the police department's glowing press release about their new hire. The headline wrote itself: "Hero cop or hypocrisy? New IA chief arrested by his own department on day one." By nightfall, the video was national news. It was on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, each network spinning the narrative to fit its own agenda. But the central, damning image was the same: a well-dressed black man being arrested by an aggressive white cop. It was a story as old as America, but the context, that the man in cuffs was a high-ranking police official himself, made it a uniquely potent symbol of a system broken at its core. The police department was caught completely flat-footed. Chief Donovan, who had been desperately trying to manage the crisis internally, was now facing a public relations apocalypse. He called an emergency press conference. He stood at a podium, flanked by the city's legal team, his face grim and sweat beading on his forehead. "The incident involving Mr. Harper is the subject of a thorough and ongoing internal investigation," he said, reading from a prepared statement. "We take any allegation of misconduct seriously. Officer Vance has been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome of this review. We ask for the public's patience as we work to uncover the full facts of this situation." The press corps was merciless. "Chief, are you saying your officer didn't know he was arresting his own new deputy chief? Can you confirm that Mr. Harper was arrested for stealing a car that is, in fact, registered to him at that address? Chief Donovan, the man in that video is the person you hired to police your own officers. Doesn't this incident prove he's going to have his work cut out for him?" Donovan stammered, offering only platitudes and evasions. The press conference was a disaster. He looked weak. His department looked incompetent, and his officer looked like a poster child for police overreach. For David, the media storm was an unwelcome intrusion. His face was everywhere. His quiet professional life had been turned into a public spectacle. Friends and former colleagues from Chicago called, their voices a mixture of shock and support. He became an unwilling symbol, his arrest a flashpoint in the national conversation about race and policing. Evelyn Reed, however, understood the power of the moment. "This is our leverage," she told David, as they watched the chief's disastrous press conference on her office TV. "They can't bury this now. They can't control the narrative. That bystander's video has done more in 12 hours than we could have done in 12 months of legal filings. It put a face to the injustice." The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold legal language the horrifying events of the previous day, now backed by the undeniable power of viral video evidence. It named Officer Kyler Vance and the city as defendants. The battle lines had been drawn not just in a courthouse, but on every television screen and social media feed in the country. The city was no longer just facing a lawsuit. It was facing a referendum on its very soul. In the world of high-stakes municipal litigation, the first move from a city attorney's office is rarely about justice. It's about damage control. It's a calculated probe, a test of the plaintiff's resolve, designed to find the cheapest possible exit from a public relations nightmare. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, with the viral video still circulating and editorials nationwide condemning the department, Evelyn Reed received the call she had been expecting. She put the city's lead counsel on speakerphone so David, sitting opposite her at the vast mahogany desk, could hear for himself. The lawyer's voice was smooth, conciliatory, the sound of a man trying to put out a fire with a garden hose. "Evelyn, let's be frank," the attorney, a man named Gerald Finney, began. "This situation has been unfortunate for all involved. We have a young officer who made a judgment call under pressure and a highly respected incoming official who was subjected to an unfortunate misunderstanding. There's no desire on our part to drag this through the courts. The city is prepared to make a good faith offer to make this right, so we can all move forward." Evelyn's face remained impassive. "I'm listening, Gerald." "The city will, of course, cover all of Mr. Harper's legal fees to date," Finney continued. "And as a gesture of our sincere apology for the distress this has caused him, we are prepared to offer a settlement of $50,000. There was a moment of pure, unadulterated silence in Evelyn's office. David stared at the speakerphone, his expression unreadable. He had been assaulted, unlawfully arrested, publicly humiliated, and turned into a reluctant symbol of a national crisis. His professional life had been thrown into chaos, and the city's valuation of that distress was $50,000. Evelyn Reed let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cold, dangerous sound. $50,000, Gerald? Are you serious? It's a nuisance value offer, Evelyn. You know how this works, Finney said, his smooth tone fraying slightly. It's a recognition of the inconvenience, not an admission of wrongdoing. A nuisance value? Evelyn's voice was now laced with ice. Your officer, Gerald, committed battery and false arrest against a superior officer in violation of his constitutional rights. Your department has become a national laughingstock. This isn't a nuisance. This is a 5-alarm fire, and you're trying to put it out with a check that wouldn't even cover the down payment on the vehicle my client was accused of stealing. David leaned forward slightly. Ask him if the offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded. And, Gerald, I assume this generous offer comes with the standard NDA? You want us to take your pocket change and, in return, Mr. Harper agrees to remain silent forever? That's standard procedure, Finney admitted. It allows the city to resolve the matter without further public comment. That was the heart of it. The offer wasn't an apology. It was the price of silence. It was a pittance meant to buy David's story, to bury it before it could get any more expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by men in suits who saw this not as a profound violation of civil rights, but as a political problem to be managed. They thought they could write a check and make the inconvenient truth disappear. No, David said, his voice quiet but firm enough for the speakerphone to pick it up. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Finney said. Evelyn Reed leaned into the phone, her voice dripping with contempt. What my client said, Gerald, is no. In fact, let me be clearer. Your offer is not just rejected, it is an insult. It's a reflection of the same arrogance and dismissiveness that caused this incident in the first place. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You misjudged Mr. Harper in that garage, and you're misjudging him now. He is not interested in a quick payday. He is interested in justice. So here is our counteroffer. You can preserve every piece of evidence, every email, every report related to this case, because our next conversation will be during depositions. We will see you in court. She disconnected the call, plunging the office back into silence. The city's lawyers had made a critical, catastrophic error. They had assumed this was about money. They had mistaken David Harper's quiet dignity for weakness. They didn't understand that his fight was no longer just about his own vindication. It was about the principle. It was for every other person who had been in a similar situation but didn't have a title, a lawyer like Evelyn Reed, or a viral video to back them up. The city's insulting offer had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of silencing him, it galvanized him. It transformed any lingering thoughts of a quiet resolution into an ironclad commitment to see this through to the end. They had tried to put a price on his integrity. They were about to find out it wasn't for sale. The battle was just beginning. The rejection of the city's settlement offer triggered the next phase of the lawsuit, discovery. It is a stage of legal warfare that lacks the drama of a courtroom confrontation, but is often where cases are truly won or lost. It is a slow, methodical siege, a relentless campaign fought with paper and digital files, designed to unearth every secret, expose every lie, and strip the opposing side of any place to hide. Evelyn Reed's office transformed into a command center. Her team, a group of sharp, dedicated young lawyers and paralegals, issued a sweeping set of subpoenas and requests for production. They didn't just want the incident report, they wanted everything. They demanded Officer Kyler Vance's complete, unredacted personnel file, including every citizen complaint, every use of force report, and every psychological evaluation he had ever undergone. They requested the department's training manuals on use of force, de-escalation, and interaction with other law enforcement agencies. They asked for all internal emails, text messages, and memos related to the incident, to David's hiring, and to the subsequent fallout. The city's response was predictable. They tried to stall, to obstruct. Their lawyers filed motions to quash the subpoenas, claiming the requests were overly broad and burdensome. They produced heavily redacted documents, with entire paragraphs blacked out, citing privacy concerns and officer safety. Evelyn fought them at every turn. She filed motions to compel, dragging the city's attorneys before a federal magistrate judge who was quickly losing patience with their tactics. Ms. Reed's client is the incoming head of internal affairs for your police department, the judge said, her voice sharp during one hearing. The idea that you need to protect an officer's privacy from him is ludicrous. Produce the files, all of them, unredacted. Slowly, painfully, the city's defenses began to crumble. The documents started to flow in, arriving in massive bankers' boxes and encrypted hard drives. Evelyn's team worked day and night, sifting through the mountain of information, looking for patterns, for contradictions, for the smoking gun. They found it in Kyler Vance's personnel file. It was a revelation. In his short 6-year career, Vance had accumulated over a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority. There were accusations of illegal searches, verbal harassment, and overly aggressive traffic stops. The pattern was undeniable. Vance was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had consistently failed to address. In every single case, the internal investigation had cleared him of wrongdoing, usually with a gentle admonition to improve his community interaction skills. The file was a portrait of a system designed not to correct behavior, but to protect its own, no matter how problematic the officer. "This is it," Evelyn said, sliding the file across the conference table to David. "This is how we prove a pattern of deliberate indifference. They knew he was a problem. They knew he was aggressive and had poor judgment. They did nothing. They kept putting him on the street. They are just as culpable as he is. But all of it, the personnel files, the training manuals, the internal emails, was secondary to the one piece of evidence that Evelyn knew would decide the case. The one digital file they had fought the hardest for, the one the city was most reluctant to produce. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive, delivered by a court courier. The complete, unedited footage from Officer Kyler Vance's body camera. The city had delayed its release for months, claiming technical glitches and chain-of-custody concerns. But Evelyn knew the real reason. They were terrified of what it showed. The bystander's video was powerful, but it was shaky, distant, and incomplete. The body camera was the truth, an unblinking first-person account of the entire encounter, from the moment Vance stepped out of his car to the moment he placed David in the back of the cruiser. Evelyn had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. David sat beside her. Mark O'Malley, who had resigned from the force a month after the incident and was now the lawsuit's star witness, was there too, his presence a quiet act of solidarity. "Are you ready for this, David?" Evelyn asked gently. Watching it from his perspective, it won't be easy. David took a deep breath, his face a mask of resolve. He had experienced it. Now he needed to see it, to witness his own humiliation through the eyes of the man who had inflicted it. "Play it," he said. The slow, grinding battle for documents was over. It was time to see the unvarnished truth. The screen flickered to life. The first image was a jarring, unsteady view of the patrol car's dashboard, followed by the sight of Kyler Vance's hands on the steering wheel. The audio crackled, picking up the last moments of his conversation with Mark O'Malley about maintaining standards. Then the dispatcher's call. The video provided a visceral, first-person perspective, placing them all inside Kyler Vance's head as the cruiser raced toward the Westgate lofts. The camera shook as he got out of the car. The audio was crystal clear. The hum of the garage, the distant city traffic, the sound of his own breathing, amplified and unnervingly intimate. He began to walk, and the camera's perspective became his own, a relentless, forward-moving view of the confrontation to come. He unholstered his weapon, and the lens dipped to show the black Glock in his hand, held at a low-ready position. Then the camera centered on David. He was kneeling slightly, his back to them, a picture of calm focus as he worked the tool in the door. He looked exactly like what he was, a man trying to solve a frustrating problem. "Police! Let me see your hands! Do it now!" The voice was Vance's own, booming and distorted, coming from the very source of the recording. The camera recorded David's slow, deliberate turn, his hands raised, his expression calm. It captured every detail Evelyn Reed had predicted. There was no fear, no panic, no aggression from David Harper. There was only a weary composure. The footage was even more damning than they could have hoped. It perfectly corroborated every detail of David's account. It showed his repeated, patient attempts to explain the situation. "This is my vehicle. My ID is in my back right pocket." The camera remained fixed on David, but the audio captured Mark O'Malley's voice from off-screen, a voice of hesitant reason. "Kai, maybe we should make that call, just to be sure." The camera didn't waver. It recorded Vance's dismissive tone, his refusal to listen, his laser focus on his own narrative. Then came the moment of the reveal. "My name is David Harper, and as of this coming Monday, I'll be the new Deputy Chief of the Internal Affairs Division. I think I'm going to be your new boss." Watching it now from Vance's perspective was chilling. The camera showed a man who was not processing new information, but hearing a direct threat. The lens seemed to zoom in slightly, the focus hardening. It recorded David's calm, detailed explanation of the internal memo and the chief's assistant. It recorded his final warning. "Officer Vance, this is your last opportunity to stop." Then came the escalation. The camera lurched forward as Vance moved in. The world became a chaotic jumble of David's shoulder, the side of the SUV, and the concrete floor. The microphone, inches from Vance's mouth, picked up his own grunts of exertion and his shouted commands. "He's resisting!" The lie was stark, undeniable. The video showed no resistance. It showed only a man standing still, absorbing the assault. Then, the most crucial moment. The camera view swung wildly as Vance forced David's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect, sickening clarity. The video continued for another 15 minutes. It recorded David's calm invocation of his rights. It recorded Vance's sneering retort as he shoved him toward the patrol car. It showed the long, silent ride to the precinct, the camera fixed on the back of David's head through the plexiglass divider. It recorded the entire booking process, capturing Sergeant Rostova's skeptical questions and Vance's increasingly defensive answers. It was a complete, uninterrupted record of a catastrophic failure of judgment, a documentary of a man destroying his own career, one terrible decision at a time. When the video ended, the conference room was utterly silent. Mark O'Malley was shaking his head slowly, his face ashen. He had lived it, but seeing it from his partner's point of view made it 1,000 times worse. "He just wouldn't listen," he whispered. David felt strangely numb. He felt vindicated, but also profoundly sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Vance's official report, every self-serving statement the city had made in its press releases, was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Evelyn Reed sat back in her chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across her face. She looked at David. "In 30 years of practicing law," she said, her voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful, self-incriminating piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest, it recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for the truth." She stood up and began to pace the room, energized, a predator who had just been handed the keys to the cage. "This changes everything. Their entire strategy was to paint you as uncooperative, as the source of the conflict. This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm and professional. Vance wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle having his authority questioned." She stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage, and they will know their case is unwinnable. They will come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a big one." She turned to David, her eyes glinting. "But we are not going to take it. We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to put Kyler Vance on the stand, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, David. It's about getting you justice, the kind of justice that changes laws." A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile, airless confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is a more brutal arena. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, a legal autopsy designed to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie, and to lock them into a version of events they can never change. Officer Kyler Vance walked into the deposition room, flanked by 2 attorneys from the city, including Gerald Finney. He wore his uniform, crisp and pressed, a suit of armor he believed would protect him. His posture was ramrod straight, his expression a mask of defiant confidence. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative suspect. He believed his badge and his carefully crafted official report would be his shield. He was wrong. For the first hour, one of the city's attorneys led Vance through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a high-risk scene, his attempts to secure the area, and Mr. Harper's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job by the book. He called David's claim of being the new deputy chief an outlandish and obvious attempt to intimidate an officer and obstruct an investigation. Then it was Evelyn Reed's turn. She began calmly, her questions simple and direct. "Officer Vance, you've been with the department for 6 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And in that time, have you received training on identifying and de-escalating situations involving individuals who may not pose a physical threat?" "Yes, ma'am. We receive extensive training." "And does that training instruct you that verbal claims, especially ones that can be easily verified, should be investigated before resorting to force?" Vance shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene and ensure officer safety." "That wasn't my question, officer," Evelyn said, her voice still mild. "Did you at any point believe your life or your partner's life was in danger?" "You can never know for sure," Vance began. "Did Mr. Harper make any threatening movements toward you?" Evelyn pressed. "No, but his verbal demeanor was calm?" Evelyn interjected. "Was articulate? Did that strike you as a threat?" The city's attorney objected. Evelyn just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you feel it was necessary to draw your weapon?" "I did upon initial approach," Vance said stiffly. "It was a tactical decision." "A tactical decision you made before Mr. Harper had even turned around, correct?" Evelyn nodded slowly, then turned to her paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit, body camera footage of Officer Vance. Timestamp 10/14/22. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the parking garage. Evelyn had Vance watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival, his shouted commands, and David's slow, calm compliance. "Officer," Evelyn said, pausing the video, "at this point you had been on scene for less than a minute. Mr. Harper has complied with your order to show his hands and turn around. Yet you describe him in your report as hostile. Can you point to the hostility on that screen for me?" Vance stared at the frozen image of David, hands raised. "It's not just about what you see, it's his tone, the overall situation." "His tone, which was calm?" Evelyn asked. "The situation, which involved a man locked out of his own car? Let's continue." She played the next segment, the one where David explained who he was. She paused it again, right after David said, "I think I'm going to be your new boss." "Officer, a citizen has just made a rather astonishing claim, a claim that, if true, would dramatically change the nature of this interaction. What was your next step, according to your training, to verify that claim?" "I believed he was lying to obstruct the investigation," Vance repeated, his jaw tight. "Why?" Evelyn pounced. "What evidence did you have that he was lying, other than your own gut feeling? Did you call the station? Did you ask your partner to run his name through the department database? Did you take any investigative steps at all? Or did you simply decide it was impossible for the man standing in front of you to hold such a position?" For the next 4 hours, Evelyn dismantled Vance's story piece by piece, using his own camera footage as the wrecking ball. She forced him to watch himself shove David against the car. "Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer." Vance stared at the screen, his face pale. "I am effecting an arrest of a resisting suspect." "You are physically assaulting an unresisting citizen and superior officer," Evelyn corrected him. "Did you see Mr. Harper resist in that clip? Did you see anything other than a man losing his balance after you shoved him? Let's watch it again." By the end of the deposition, Kyler Vance was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. Gerald Finney and the city's other attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Evelyn Reed had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Evelyn's relentless surgical questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The city was defenseless. The day after the deposition was a disaster. Ben Carter's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city of Tampa. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of defeat. "They want to settle," Carter told Maya later that day in his office. "They know the deposition was a disaster. They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. They're no longer talking about nuisance value." He slid a piece of paper across his desk. On it was a number, $750,000. Maya stared at the figure. It was an incredible amount of money, a life-changing sum. It was an admission of guilt, a clear signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on. A year's salary for her was around $60,000. This was more than 10 times that. It was enough to pay off her mortgage, set up a college fund for her kids, and live without financial worry for years. It was everything the city had said her ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of her, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to say yes. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to stop the endless meetings, the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. She wanted to go back to her life, to her ambulance, to the simple, profound work of saving people. "What do you think?" she asked Carter, her voice quiet. Carter leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "From a purely financial perspective, it's a very strong offer. We could probably push them to $1 million, but this is in the ballpark of a major victory without the risk and stress of a trial. If you take this, you walk away with financial security, and we can probably get them to expunge the arrest record as part of the deal. No one would blame you for taking it." He paused, his gaze steady. "But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me for justice." Justice? The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair? Officer Miller would likely be fired, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, would remain unchanged. The next Officer Miller in another city on another highway could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix her problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. She thought about Mark Coleman, who was beginning a long, painful rehabilitation, his life forever diminished. She thought about the messages of support she'd received from EMTs and paramedics across the country. Stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied, threatened, and treated like subordinates instead of partners. She thought of the fear they all felt, the worry that doing their job correctly could cost them their own. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The viral videos, the media attention, the deposition, it had all turned her case into something bigger. It had become a test case, a potential landmark for the rights of all first responders. "This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it?" Maya asked. Carter nodded. "Of course they want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court, that Miller's deposition transcript is never released." That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy her story, to bury the truth she had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay her to pretend this never happened. "No," Maya said, the single word firm and clear. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. No deal. A slow smile spread across Ben Carter's face. It was the answer he had been hoping for. "I thought you might say that. This isn't about the money, Ben," Maya continued, leaning forward, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "It was never about the money. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court. I want Miller to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury. And I want a verdict that sends a message not just to the city of Tampa, but to every police department in this country that you do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life. Period." Her stand was a declaration. She was turning down a fortune for a principle. She was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort of a private settlement. It was a choice that would require immense courage. But for Maya, it was the only choice she could live with. She had fought for her patient on the side of the road, and now she would fight for every patient and every paramedic in a court of law. The city thought they could buy her off. They were about to learn that her integrity was not for sale. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation for David. Evelyn Reed and her team put him through mock cross-examinations, peppering him with the most aggressive accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare him for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that his composure, which had been so powerful on the body cam footage, would hold under the withering pressure of a courtroom. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a form of theater, and the first act was jury selection, or voir dire. This was where the tone of the entire trial would be set. It was a painstaking process of questioning a pool of ordinary citizens to uncover biases, both conscious and unconscious, that could influence their judgment. David sat at the plaintiff's table beside Evelyn, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately, wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of the community: teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide his fate. The city's legal team, led by Gerald Finney, was looking for a specific type of juror. They wanted people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong, people for whom the uniform was a symbol of unimpeachable authority. Their questions were designed to root out skepticism. Do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer, without question, for the sake of safety? Finney asked one potential juror, a stern-looking man in his 60s. Do any of you have family members or close friends who have had a negative experience with law enforcement? He asked the group at large. Evelyn Reed's approach was the opposite. She was searching for empathy, but more importantly, for critical thinking. She was looking for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who could see shades of gray, and people who were not so blinded by the authority of a badge that they couldn't recognize an abuse of it. Her questions were more nuanced, more probing. Imagine a situation, she proposed to the panel, where a fire captain tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put for an investigation. In that moment of conflict, whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? One potential juror, a retired Air Force colonel, answered without hesitation. You trust the expert in the relevant field. The firefighter knows fire. The cop knows the law. You don't ask a lawyer to put out a fire. Evelyn made a small, satisfied check mark on her notepad. Another potential juror, a young software engineer, was questioned by Finney. Do you believe police officers have a difficult and dangerous job? Of course, the young man answered. And do you believe they sometimes have to make split-second decisions to maintain control? Yes, the man said, but I also believe they have a responsibility not to create a crisis where one doesn't exist. Finney thanked him and moved on, but Evelyn's eyes lingered on the man. She had found someone who could see the difference between action and escalation. The process took 2 full days. It was a fascinating, high-stakes exercise in human psychology. David watched as potential jurors were dismissed for a variety of reasons. A man whose brother was a cop was struck by Evelyn. A woman who expressed deep vocal distrust for all forms of government authority was struck by the city. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end of the second day, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group. The retired Air Force colonel had made it. So had the young software engineer. There was a registered nurse, a high school history teacher, a stay-at-home mother, a plumber, and several others. Evelyn was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority, but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that body camera footage and see not an officer and a civilian, but 2 public servants with competing duties, and judge which one had been catastrophically derelict. As they left the courthouse that evening, The reality of the situation finally hit David with its full weight. The next morning, the trial would begin. His life, his reputation, and a cause that had become much bigger than himself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. "How are you feeling?" Evelyn asked, sensing his anxiety. "Like I'm about to face the most important investigation of my life," David admitted, his voice quiet. Evelyn stopped and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been preparing for this your whole career, David. Not in law books, but on the streets, in the interrogation rooms, in every crisis you've ever managed. All you have to do tomorrow is the same thing you did in that garage. Stay calm, be professional, and tell the truth. The truth is all we need." Her words were a comfort, but as he drove home, David knew that the truth was a fragile thing. In a courtroom, it could be twisted, obscured, and attacked. His principled stand had led him here. Now, all he could do was trust that the truth, and the 12 people chosen to hear it, would be enough. The energy in the courtroom was electric on the 4th day of the trial. The preceding days had been filled with testimony that built a powerful narrative foundation. Mark O'Malley had testified, his voice heavy with regret, about his partner's uncontrollable aggression. Sergeant Rostova had described her immediate doubts and the unprofessionalism of the arrest. Even Sarah Jenkins, the bystander, had taken the stand to describe the unsettling scene she had recorded. But everyone knew this was the day the jury would see what happened for themselves. Evelyn Reed began the morning by calling her final witness, David Harper. David walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. He looked professional and composed in a simple dark suit. For an hour, Evelyn led him through his story, his distinguished career, his hiring as deputy chief, and the events in the parking garage. His testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. He spoke not as a victim, but as a senior law enforcement professional, analyzing a catastrophic failure in judgment and procedure. Then, Evelyn walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. "Your Honor," she said, her voice resonating through the silent courtroom, "the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Kyler Vance, marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit A." The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the room. The video began to play. For the next 20 minutes, the jury was transported to that concrete garage. They saw the scene not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who had caused the crisis. They saw David's focused, calm demeanor. They heard his patient explanations. They heard Mark O'Malley's ignored pleas for caution. They heard Vance's aggressive demands and his dismissive, contemptuous laugh when David revealed his identity. They heard him literally say, "You're a car thief who got caught, and now you're trying to talk your way out of it." And then they saw it. They saw Vance, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab David. They saw him spin him around and force his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman, the registered nurse, put her hand over her mouth in shock. A man on the back row, the plumber, shook his head slowly in disbelief. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore. They were witnessing an assault. They were watching a man's constitutional rights being violated in real time. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The city's attorney, Gerald Finney, knew he was in deep trouble. His cross-examination of David was tentative, almost apologetic. He tried to portray David as insubordinate, but the video had already refuted that. "Mr. Harper," Finney began, "you'd agree that when a police officer gives you an order, you should follow it for everyone's safety." "I agree that I should follow a lawful order," David corrected him gently. "An order to submit to a baseless arrest in violation of my civil rights is not a lawful order. My duty in that moment was to not escalate a situation your officer had already pushed to a dangerous breaking point." Finney had no effective rebuttal. David's testimony, backed by the irrefutable evidence of the video, was a fortress. After David stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Kyler Vance. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. Finney led him through his testimony, but it was a hollow exercise. Everyone in the room had already seen the truth. His claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent suspect sounded absurd after watching the video. Then it was Evelyn's turn for cross-examination. She approached the witness stand not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. "Officer Vance," she began, "we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a man who calmly told you who he was and tried to explain he was locked out of his own car. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, sitting here in this courtroom, is there anything you would have done differently?" It was a lifeline, a chance for Vance to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, "In hindsight, I should have waited." He could have said, "I misjudged the situation." He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same corrosive pride that had caused this entire disaster, would not let him. "No," Vance said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene from a non-compliant individual." Evelyn Reed let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. She walked back to the plaintiff's table. "No further questions, Your Honor." It was a mic drop moment. In that single defiant answer, Kyler Vance had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. He confirmed for them that he was not an officer who had made a terrible mistake under pressure, but a man who fundamentally believed his authority was more important than the truth, more important than another citizen's rights. The jurors' faces were like stone. They had seen the video, and now they had seen the man. And in their eyes, there was no doubt left at all. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Gerald Finney, for the city, did his best with a losing hand. He argued that Officer Vance's actions, while perhaps not ideal, were made in a high-stress environment. He painted him as a young officer trying to do his job, trying to impose order based on a credible 911 call. He pleaded with the jury not to judge him with the benefit of hindsight. "Police officers don't have the luxury of slow-motion replays," he argued. "They have to make split-second decisions. Officer Vance made a decision. It may not have been the perfect decision, but it was not a violation of the Constitution." Then Evelyn Reed rose to give her closing statement. She didn't shout. She didn't use flashy rhetoric. She spoke with a quiet, righteous anger that was far more powerful. She stood directly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each of them. "For 4 days we have talked about laws and procedures and amendments," she began. "But this case isn't really about that. This case is about a choice. Officer Kyler Vance arrived at a scene where a man was locked out of his car, and he had a choice. He could have chosen to investigate. He could have chosen to listen. He could have chosen to take 30 seconds to run a license plate, to make a phone call, to do the basic work of a police officer. He could have chosen to be a partner in solving a problem." She walked over to the evidence table and picked up a pair of handcuffs, holding them up for the jury to see. But he didn't. Instead, he chose this. He chose his ego. He chose his authority. He looked at a man who calmly and truthfully told him who he was and decided that his own gut feeling was more important than the facts. He chose to turn a citizen's minor inconvenience into a traumatic, unconstitutional seizure. She let the silence hang in the air. David Harper also had a choice. He could have been angry. He could have been loud. He could have argued. But he chose to be calm. He chose to be professional. He chose to de-escalate. He chose to honor the profession of law enforcement, even as that profession was failing him right before his eyes. He chose to be the kind of police officer that Kyler Vance was not. She turned and pointed at Vance, who sat stiffly at the defense table. His decision cost David Harper his dignity, his liberty, and his faith in the system he was hired to help lead. Your decision today will be about the consequences for that choice. Evelyn turned back to the jury, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The city wants you to believe this was a split-second decision gone wrong. But the video shows you this was a minutes-long campaign of intimidation. They want you to excuse his actions, but he sat on that stand yesterday and told you he wouldn't change a thing. He is asking you to ratify his behavior. He is asking you to tell every police officer in this country that it is acceptable to ignore the truth, to escalate a peaceful situation, and to arrest a citizen without cause simply because their pride has been wounded. She paused, letting her final words sink in. Your verdict will do more than decide this case. It will send a message about what we value as a society. Do we value blind obedience over truth? Do we value ego over justice? Do we value a badge over a citizen's constitutional rights? Send a message that the answer is no. Send a message that will hold power accountable. Send a message that justice in this courtroom is not for sale. The jury filed out of the room. The wait began. An hour passed. Then 2. The tension in the courtroom was a physical thing. Just after 3 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The jurors filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman, the retired Air Force colonel, handed a slip of paper to the clerk. The clerk handed it to the judge, who read it, his expression unchanging, and handed it back to the clerk to be read aloud. In the matter of Harper versus Vance and the city, the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, David Harper. A gasp went through the courtroom. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, David Harper. David squeezed his eyes shut, a single long-held breath escaping his lips. Evelyn put a comforting hand on his shoulder. We will now read the damages, the clerk continued. For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $2 million. The number was staggering, but the foreman wasn't finished. And for punitive damages, to be levied against Officer Kyler Vance and the city for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $15 million. The courtroom erupted in stunned murmurs. $17 million. It was a thunderous verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to send a message. The jury hadn't just sided with David, they had adopted his outrage. They had sent the message Evelyn had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. David opened his eyes, not with triumph, but with a profound sense of vindication. The jury had seen him, they had heard him, and they had believed him. Justice had been done. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to trace the hairline fractures of choice and circumstance that led to that confrontation in the garage. What drove Officer Kyler Vance? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious. A deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he was a product of a culture that equated strength with control, where any challenge, especially from a calm, articulate black man in a position of perceived subservience, was seen not as a point of information, but as a direct threat to his identity. He was trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, and in his mind, David's refusal to immediately fold made him just another threat. If Vance had been able to pause, to listen, to see the man before him as a citizen instead of a suspect, the entire tragedy could have been averted. And what of David? If he had been less confident, less assured in his own truth, would he have backed down? If he hadn't possessed that core of steel forged by 2 decades of police work, perhaps he would have made the easier choice, to become loud, to argue, to match Vance's energy, and in doing so, to validate the officer's false narrative of a hostile suspect. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of discipline that had unknowingly armed him for that specific fight. His calm refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent understanding that true authority comes not from a badge, but from integrity. The incident reminds us that courage isn't always about loud confrontation. Sometimes, it's about holding fast to one's principles with a quiet, unshakable resolve, especially when the personal cost is highest. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to the truth can expose and correct a systemic flaw, creating a legacy of accountability for thousands who follow. It asks us to consider what we would do when our own truth clashes with a demand from a flawed authority. What do you think is the most important lesson from David's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's quiet composure was mistaken for weakness or defiance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.